Yo, what is up, guys? Edge TCG here, also known as Eddie Strom. I'm here to give you guys a in-depth video on my Genesis point suggestions. Now, if you don't want to hear me blabber on for the next however many minutes, you can check the description. I will have this whole slideshow in there so you guys can go through it real quick. But if you want to hear me blabber for a little bit, stick around. You guys can also subscribe. I'd greatly appreciate it. But yeah, this is just my Genesis point suggestions for what they should do for specific decks, for whole types of cards, for whole decks of cards that are inadequately pointed for how the metagame is shaped up. So you guys will see everything I'm explaining in time. But yeah, before we begin, I'd like to shout out Michael Arisman for helping me with the idea of this. And also, if you guys want your voice to be heard like I'm trying to express mine, use the hashtag Yu-Gi-Oh! Genesis hashtag. Allegedly, they look at this and look at those hashtags for ideas on how to adjust the points. So maybe they'll be taking a look at this video and we'll use some of my ideas. So let's begin. Quickly, why am I qualified to speak on this? Well, I think I am pretty qualified. I've gotten first, second, and third into the last 3 Genesis Invitationals in North America, and I think I know a thing or two about Genesis. So let's go on. First deck, my bread and butter, Dracotail. Deck's really good. They've adjusted the points 3 times, and the deck's still broken. Is it broken? No. Is it really good? Yeah. I honestly would put it as one of the best decks in Genesis. And as are many of the other decks I will be suggesting points for to be hit. But yeah, it's one of the best decks, and I think there's a few reasons for that. One is Secretarion. Secretarion makes pretty much infinite loops. You can pretty much infinitely add back cards. Put back your Arthalion, and then Arthalion can add this back, and it's a whole loop. Not that you do that often, but it's really good. Secretarion offers so much recursion. It's also really oppressive. There are a lot of dragon and spellcaster decks, and if it's not a spellcaster or dragon deck, a lot of decks do play dragons and spellcasters. Take for example, Dragon Rulers. That deck gets severely hurt by something like Secretarion. Also, Monarchs have spellcasters in their deck that special summon, like the little guys, and Secretarion's really good at dealing with those too. It's just too easy to make, too oppressive, and too recurable. It makes the deck just a whole another level of broken. I'm going to suggest that this card goes to 12 points. You'll see why shortly. Next, we have Rahu. Now, Rahu is one potential hit that Dracotail could have that would have a pretty impactful effect on the deck in Genesis. But the reason I like Rahu the most is because if you don't point Rahu, it has the ability to become a board breaker in the future. Now, I don't know if that is a bad thing, but Rahu is pretty broken by the fact that if you don't touch Rahu, you make it 0 points. In a year in Genesis, you could activate Rahu, send a Panda Urgla, summon a Gulamel, and now you have pretty much 2 pops just because you have Rahu in your deck and it's 0 points. So if they don't adjust Rahu now, I don't know if they ever will, and I think Rahu should be pointed. Probably about 5 points. I think that's about a perfect number because if you do the math, if you play Secretarion and 3 Rahu, your deck's aligned with the TCG Advanced format in terms of the amount of cards you're allowed to play. Obviously, there's some leeway with that if you want to cut some certain things, but regardless, I think that this is the best way to go for Dracotail. Next, we have Kewl Tune, another one of the most powerful decks in Genesis. I think it is so powerful because of Q. Q is the best card in the deck, second to none. While a lot of the other guys search, he lets you special, and he lets you special a tuner, pretty much any tuner, and that is really broken, especially in combination with something like Red Nova. Like, things get out of hand really quick. So I think Q does too much as a 1-card starter. If people want to continue to play it, there's a lot of ways to do that. There's a lot of search cards and stuff. They can play less copies of that, so that's fine. But if you play less copies of a card like Q, then it becomes more susceptible to other forms of interruption, such as a very popular card like DD Crow. If you get Q out of rotation in the deck, then the deck might be significantly less powerful because they don't have this to fall back on. I think maybe 10 points for Q should be good. This deck's a really slippery slope because if you point it too much, then they can't play hand traps. If they can't play hand traps, the deck's effectively worthless because the deck needs some kind of tuners in the hand to play. And I think if those tuners aren't hand traps, especially these like weak hand traps that a lot of these decks are playing, then the deck will be really bad. So again, a really slippery slope um, in terms of what the deck should be hit. Another thing is Red Nova. Red Nova is probably one of the best cards in the deck. I saw a really interesting build at the most recent YCS where someone was playing, I believe, multiple Red Novas. I could be wrong, and they were playing things like Decatron and all these cool cards, and it just really made me realize the power of Red Nova. I think it's crazy that it can not only summon more Kewl Tunes, but it can summon a bunch of other things, and it's just another Q when you really look at it, and it's really really good. Um, I think this should be 15 points. I think that Konami maybe didn't design Kewl Tune to have Red Nova in mind. Maybe they didn't. I don't know. But I think that if you want Kewl Tune to be played as it's supposed to be played, then Red Nova should get some points too. That way, people have to decide if they want to play a Kewl Tune deck with hand traps or if they want to play a more combo deck with Red Nova. So you have to give and take. Next is Monarch. Now, Monarch is really powerful. Currently, there are two ways I've seen people play it. One is the pot of greed approach. People play multiple pot of greeds, and they play this trap card that pretty much has all the OG Monarchs effects, as long as they control a tribute summon monster, and as long as your opponent special summons. And they rip a few cards out of the hand with Erebus, and then they set up a trap, and most of the time that's good enough. But I think Erebus wasn't properly pointed. I forget the name of it. There's another Monarch that's 80 points. I think that Monarch's a little better than Erebus, but it's in the same ballpark. And I think if you could only play one Erebus, then your deck can still do a lot. It can still hand rip multiple times via adding it back, but it's also more susceptible to cards in the format, such as DD Crow. So I think 80 points pretty much limits Erebus and lets you have some room for other cards. I don't know if 80 points is an exact number, but I do think this needs to be addressed. If you put Erebus at 80, or pretty much anything above 49, then it can't play Domain and Erebus, and I think that's where the deck becomes really oppressive, where not only do they hand rip you, but they also lock you off from the extra deck, and that can really harm a lot of decks. So I think that Monarch should be pointed, and I think Erebus is the best way to do that. Something I do want to mention, and I'll talk about this later, but Monarch is also inadvertently one of the decks that gets affected very much by a lot of the 0.9 engine, and the Monarch's powerful enough to power through that. But things like Crow, Skullmeister, even Lancia, if people want to play it, are all cards that are 0 points, and Crow and Meister are somewhat popular, and they both heavily impact Monarch. And I just want to put the seed out there, like the idea of this, that cards like decks need to be pointed for what the meta calls for, and the meta calls for playing cards like DD Crow and Skullmeister. So maybe 80 points is harsh with Monarch because those cards are in the format, but I think the deck needs to be addressed, and I think this is one way to do so. But just planting that seed for later on. But next, talking about Radiant Typhoon. It took away the win at the most recent YCS. Mostly my fault because I played bad, but good player. Congratulations to him. This deck needs to be adjusted. I think it needs to be adjusted via hitting Crocea and Visions. Now, Crocea is one of the best cards in the deck. It searches, obviously, and it's no points. I think it's kind of funny that the generic cards like Chant, and I think it's Eldma, are points, yet the best card in the actual deck is not points. The second best card in the deck, Visions, also should be points. I think it should be about 3 points for Visions and 10 points for Crocea. Visions was a card that's being splashed into a lot of different decks. I believe Pack, and even I at one point, played a Radiant Typhoon deck, or not Radiant, a Memento deck with Visions in it, just because it's a powerful draw engine and it can search MST for various scenarios. I think that Visions wasn't meant to be a draw engine, and maybe should be pointed accordingly so. So I think 3 points for Visions and 10 points for Crocea is an adequate way to hit Radiant Typhoon. I also think that later on I'll talk about how Droll should be lowered in points. If Droll is more prevalent in the format, then Radiant Typhoon may not be playing a lot of the silly cards like the Noble Knight, whatever, to search these other cards because they'll be more affected by Droll and will inadvertently hit from the other point adjustments in the format. But regardless, Radiant Typhoon is really powerful and should be pointed a bit more to be more aligned with other Genesys decks. Next we have Exosister. Now, I don't think Exosister had a strong standing at the most recent YCSs. I could be wrong, but I did see a lot of people playing it, and I myself even tried it for an extensive period of time. I I spent hours toying with the deck, trying all different ratios, playing the deck. I talked to so many different people about this deck, and I think this deck's really really good. I'm surprised it didn't have a better performance at any of the recent events, and I think before it does, it needs to be pointed accordingly. Now, they have two new cards in the deck, Betrayal and Caramel. I think Caramel is pretty adequately, it doesn't have to be pointed pretty much. I think there's enough outs to it since it only negates common spells and traps, so I didn't put it here, but it's something that may have to be adjusted in the future. I do think the card on the screen you're seeing, Betrayal, needs to be pointed to at least 10 points. My reasoning is if Pax is points, then Betrayal needs to be points. Simple enough. This card is genuinely better than Pax, and it does much more for the deck. Not only does it search, so it's a consistency card, it's an additional normal to extend your combos, and it also, more importantly, banishes a card from your opponent's grave of their choice, so it triggers all your cards, especially when you summon them off Vetus. So, Betrayal is probably the best card in the deck, and it needs to be pointed accordingly. I think 10 points puts this deck, adequately in line in terms of power level with the other decks. So if they want to play multiple Betrayals and multiple Michaelis and the Spirit guys, then they don't really have that much more room from non-engine, which I don't think the deck needs because it's so powerful. So I think Betrayal at 10 is pretty good. Another card which needs to be pointed is I think it's a Soffle. Guys, if Dwellers play 100 points, this is Walking Dweller. This is the Dweller that was untouched. This is the Dweller that managed to survive. This card is every Dweller, and it's super easy to bring out because cards like Betrayal or Caramel. And I think if you want to play this card, they need to pay points for it. Now, I think if they do 30 points on a Soffle, then you really got to consider, hey, do I want to play this? A lot of decks do use the graveyard in Genesys, but not all of them, right? When I was testing this deck, there was a lot of matches where I summon I have the option to summon a Soffle. I wouldn't because I'd be playing a non-graveyard deck. Take for instance Radiant Typhoon. They don't really use the graveyard that much. While they can, they don't really do it. Take for example Vanquish Soul. They don't use the graveyard. A Soffle's pointless. But also take for example pretty much every other deck in the format. They do use the graveyard. Now you're faced with the dilemma of, hey, do I want to include a Soffle in my deck for X amount of points, but have the risk of it not even being useful? And if you run a Soffle, maybe your deck's going to be less consistent because you can't run more Betrayals, more Packs, more of the Spirit guy, etc. So I think a Soffle is a card that needs to be adjusted. I think it should be adjusted more heavily than the 10 points Michaelis has. And I think the two suggestions I made here is one of the best ways to go about that. So that's it for Exosister. Next is Vanquish Soul. Now I'm pretty surprised with the showing that Vanquish Soul had. I also extensively tested this deck for the most recent format, and I was not a fan. Some builds of this deck were playing Shifter, which I don't know if I'm a fan of that, because this deck also pairs along with, Genesys cards, and Shifter kind of conflicted with it. Regardless, also Shifter, when you shifted them, it wasn't a dark in your hand anymore, which is one of the reasons you played Shifter. Regardless, we're getting off topic. I think Vanquish Soul needs to be adjusted. The first card to be adjusted is Snow Devil. It's the best card in the deck. It's super oppressive going first. I think this card needs to be 11 points. Now, why 11? The other cards in the deck are 11. If you want to play a Snow Devil, then you can't play a Reason. Or, as you'll see soon, you can't play a Staker Soul. And while, it's pretty much going to guarantee the deck has 11 points missing from it because you're going to need to play Snow Devil. This card's really broken. A lot of decks have destruction and you can't destroy anything with Snow Devil. This card's so oppressive, in fact, that I saw a damage juggler in a list, I think in Europe. This card needs to be pointed just a little bit. And if not this, then I have some other suggestions here. Let's talk about Staker Soul. It's a extender and a starter. Give it points, guys. Make it 11 points. A lot of Vanquish Soul duelists were opting not to play Jiaolong to play multiple Sues or non-engines like Shifter. This points, instead of Jiaolong, forces them to play non-engine. I don't really know who wrote this. I think Mikey might have fumbled that paragraph, but Um, Sacred Soul should be points. If you want to play an extender or a starter and do that, you need to give up something elsewhere, right? So I think 11 points really puts things in perspective. If you view all the suggestions I said, you could play something like 3 Raisin, 2 Stake Your Soul, 1 Holly Sue, 1 Snow Devil, and 3 Jiaolong, which would be 0 points with my suggestion. Um, let's talk about that. I think Jiaolong should be 0 points. It's a card that's really good, but it's also a card that is kind of fake in a way. I obviously won with Vanquish Soul in the first ever Genesys Invitational, and a lot of times it didn't do that much. Like, sure, it would add me a lot of cards, sure, generate a lot of advantage, but when you're getting to that point of the game when you have that much advantage being generated, it really doesn't matter. Like, you really didn't need those cards. Like, you're just you're adding it for fun pretty much. And I think a lot of players realize this because a lot of people weren't even playing this. A lot of people didn't even consider playing it in the last events. So I think with it being at 0 points, I think the deck stays closer to what it's supposed to be doing, and I think it makes the deck a little more interesting. You don't even have to play 3 of it. I think it's just a good card to have. Um, yeah, I think these 3 hits, 2 Vanquish Soul, or 2 hits and 1 improvement, would make the deck a lot more fair and on a level playing field. And you'll see soon there are some more point adjustments that I will be talking about that will affect Vanquish Soul inadvertently, so stay tuned. Next, let's talk about generic cards. Droll. At 25, this card is pretty much banned. There is 0 reasons to ever play it at this point limit. Cards in line with its ability are things like Shifter, and they're pointed at 10. This card being in the format at some capacity would give a lot of people a second thought if they want to play certain cards. Now, take for example the most recent decks. I think there is a lot of decks, at least that I was seeing, playing stuff like Dual Genesys to search the Synchro card for Kewl Tune. There were 7th Ascensions being running around. There's a lot of other weird search cards. I think there's some Noble Knight card that the Genesys winner played to search another Noble Knight card to then search another search card. Like, pretty much there's too much searching going around. I really don't understand the hate of Droll and Mockbird as a card. I think in the current format, advanced format, I think it's fine to have at 3. I think in Genesys, it's fine to be at a point ability to be played at 3. I think a lot of decks don't even care about Droll and Lockbird, and if Droll's low enough points, you have to create your deck to have a plan around Droll and Lockbird. I can keep talking in circles for a long time. What I'm going to keep saying, what I'm going to say is I think Droll should be in the format. I think at 25 it will not be in the format. So I think anywhere from 12 to 15 points is a good number for it, and I think that's where it should be. Next, we're going to talk about 7th Tachyon and 7th Ascension. Now, this card is pretty much Rhoda. Not only is it Rhoda, it's better than Rhoda. It can search anything, but it's also a little more fair because you got to put a card back. And I think that too many decks can play this. And a lot of those decks that can play it would not play it if it was something like 3 points. They'd have to really think about it. So my suggestion is to put 7th Tachyon and Ascension to 3. Now, why not just Tachyon? Well, you could play 3 Ascension and 1 Tachyon if you really want, just have a 3-point with 4 searchers in your deck. Now, would that be good? No, probably not. But I think if we're being smart about it, I think Ascension also needs to be points along with Tachyon to really not limit, but put a tax on people searching pretty much any card they want. Next is a whole group of cards. Now, I just looked through all the cards that were pointed in Genesys, and these are a few that caught my mind, or caught my attention rather. These are all cards that are criminally overpointed. Now, you might look toward the end and see Fenrir and Lightning Storm, and Lightning Storm's not that many points, and Fenrir is kind of different from all the other cards. But let's talk about the first chunk. Talents and 1-for-1, like both over 90 points. Who would ever play those cards in their deck if they're above 90 points? Honestly, if Talents was 40 points or 20, if it was 20 points, I'm thinking about if I want to play it. I really don't know if I would. It's kind of funny that they put these cards at such high points. Now, I don't know if that's because they have some combo that I'm not smart enough to see that this deck or this card could be abusing, but I think a lot of these cards are criminally overpointed. Next, let's move along to like something like Fenrir. There's a lot of cards like this that are pointed so high no one would ever even consider playing them. And I don't know if that's Konami's intention for Fenrir, Castor Fenrir to be never played, but it doesn't make sense. I think this card's 30 points. For 90 points of your deck to be committed to a Fenrir that you'll see like 30% of your games, that's not even that impactful. I don't know what the correct number for any of these cards is, but I do know that they're too high right now. So my suggestion is to decrease the points on all these cards to whatever Konami feels is correct. So it's a lot to go over, but some cards are effectively banned for no reason. Next, on a slightly different note, is Bell. Bell is pretty much DD Crow and Skullmeister. I mean, obviously it's a little better, but it's very similar. And both Crow and Skullmeister are 0 points, whereas Bell is 5. I think Bell is more aligned power-wise with Mourner and Ogre. So with that in mind, I think decreasing Bell to about 3 points would be an adequate adjustment. Next, we're going to talk about some hand trap math. Now, this is pretty much all Michael's idea, so let's see what he has to say. If Ash Blossom was low, it would be auto-included in any points. That's enough to be said. If we want Ash to be 3 points, it's going to be 3 of in every single deck, and it's going to make the current format and the Genesys format pretty much too similar. But at something like 15 points, it's essentially banned. If you look at the decks that are playing this card, it's pretty much just Kewl Tune because they can search it out and they can recur it. Previously, I think I played it in Vanquish Soul when I won, and that's because there was a fire, and I can go on, but I think that 15 is way too high for a card like this. If we just make a slight adjustment, putting it down to 12, I think it'll really give people more consideration in playing it. Now, in the current format, if they want to play 3 Ash, it's 45 points. And only decks that can do that, by the way, are decks that are pretty low power because they haven't been pointed really that much, or maybe they're just not playing a lot of their pointed cards, so they're pretty low power. And I think that these decks need a little win, and that win could be giving the deck or giving Ash 3 less points just so they can add one more card of like a low impact hand trap like Mourner, maybe that updated Bell, maybe Ogre, right? Just a small point adjustment for Ash could do wonders in making people considering to play it, and I think 12 is a good number for that. Next Imperm. At 13, Imperm isn't really worth it. While it is both a hand trap and a board breaker, it's a little too high. I was thinking about the math in my head. If I'm making a deck and I have the ability to play 1 Imperm or 2 Chalice, I really don't know if I'd play Imperm. Points are so strict that I think even just a slight adjustment down for Imperm could see a lot more playability of it. If you decrease Imperm by 3, again, it allows for 3 more points to be allocated toward another low power hand trap. So I think that's where a lot of these heavily pointed hand traps need to go. They need to go down so that people could play them if they're playing a weak enough deck, and they could play them in combination with a lot other low power hand traps. So that's how I think the hand trap map should work. I don't think Genesys should become the TCG, where every deck consists of about 15 non-engine, but going second is a huge struggle in Genesys. If you guys look, a lot of these Genesys decks are watered down versions of current, or they're playing some funny cards. They're playing things like, I've seen so many just crazy synchro decks that I think if you play, some of these low power hand traps would do wonders against. So I think hand traps are a slippery slope because I don't want to see Genesys become a format where everyone plays hand traps. But I do think that a lot of the low power decks that have the ability to play hand traps should be able to do it and not be effectively banned of playing Ash because of so many points. So just a slight adjustment on both of these cards could be something to consider. Something I want to bring up is point design. Cards that are inherently side deckable shouldn't be pointed the same, even though they're the same power level as cards that are main deckable. Now, what does this mean? You'd have to be a fool to be playing Mistaken Arrest in your main deck. Now, I'll talk about this later. Mistaken Arrest should be points, but let's take Flying Sea, for example, because it is pointed. Flying Sea at 7 points, it's effectively banned. I'm not siding 21 points in my side deck for the off chance I play a level 4 deck, and the off chance that I draw it. Flying Sea is effectively banned. I'm never playing that card. And I get, Flying Sea is oppressive, and it's really good, and it's really annoying for these decks to deal with. But I think if you're going to play that type of deck, you got to prepare for it adequately, and you got to play cards to out something like Flying Sea. And I think, Flying Sea can be expanded to a lot of other cards. There's a lot of cards that can be side decked that I think should be pointed and have points assigned to them, but they should be pointed as if they are a side deck card. I worry that there's a point where they pretty much ban a lot of the side deck cards just because they assign points to them so high that you'd never consider playing them. If there's a card that you need to have only going first or going second that you would never play in a main deck, then it shouldn't be the same amount of points that a card that you would main deck would be. Does this make sense? If this doesn't make sense, I think you'll see shortly. Here's what I suggest for some generic side deck cards and what they should do. Retaliating Sea. I don't think this card will ever be played at 7 points. Again, I could be wrong, but if I'm committing 21 points to my side deck, same thing as Flying Sea, I don't think it makes sense. I think Retaliating Sea should be like 3 points. Now, this card gets a little funny because I have seen it where they play cards to search like Maxi, and they play Maxi with it. So it's a slippery slope, but I think in general, side deck cards should be at a lower point threshold than you'd imagine. Next, Mistaken Arrest. Mistaken Arrest is a mistake to be 0 points. I think that the card is just too broken to be 0. And I think putting it at something like 10, well, even a little high for my opinion, other people might disagree, I think is adequate, right? You want to really make yourself think, right, if this card is X amount of points, do I even want to include it in my side deck? Because I want my main deck to be as good as possible so I can win most of my games, not just the games where I go first or second post side. So all these cards have to be pointed with that mindset. I mentioned Flying Sea. I think 1 to 3 points would be good enough for it. It's for niche matchups that you might not even play, and even if you do play, you might not draw it. And even if you do draw it, they might have ways to out it or adjust its level or something. So it's not a guaranteed win button, and it's very easily outable. So I think that 7 points for it is way too high and is effectively banned, and no one will ever play it. There's also a whole group of cards I want to talk about. Gravity Collapse is well within that group. Now, I personally never lost to this card, but it's extremely toxic. I think a slight point increase would make people heavily consider even playing it. I think the card is pretty bad, if I'm going to be frank. I talked to some people, and they said that the card really didn't make sense to play because so many decks, don't get affected by it. But when you do get to resolve it, first off, you're just silly for playing it. But secondly, you just effectively immediately won the game. And I don't think that's what Genesys had in mind for a card like that. So I think they need to slightly adjust the points on it so that people really got to consider, hey, if I want an auto win in my deck, I have a cost to that. So that's my take on these cards. Next, I was going to talk about Shifter in an earlier point, but I forgot to include it in that point. So here we are. 3 cards here. Fissure, Cosmos, Shifter. Let's talk about the top 2 because these are like side deck cards. Again, Fissure and Cosmos, I think they are very oppressive, but they're also side deck cards, so they should not be super pointed. Even just a couple points on these cards, maybe even, I suggested 10 or 7. Even if you just do 3 points on these cards, I think any amount of points on a side deck card really makes you think twice about playing it, and I think these cards may not be played if they were any points. There is a worry that there's a graveyard deck or a banished deck, and they want cards to be banished, and they'd main it. So maybe 10 points and 7 points is correct, but those 2 cards, at least in the context of them being side deck cards, need to be pointed carefully to a point where people may want to play them. but they'd have to give up something to do so. Next, let's talk about Shifter. Shifter is insane. It is broken. It is also not that great. What do I mean? Well, when I was playing Exosister, I had many games where I shifted my opponent. I'm like, oh, I'm feeling good. I'm feeling great. I won. And that might be the case. They're playing a graveyard deck. You won. Game's over. There's also a strong chance, because it's Genesys, that your opponent's deck doesn't even use the graveyard, and you just discarded the card for fun. So when I was playing in this current format, heavily filled with graveyard decks, I'm like, wow, I'm really committing all these points to Shifter when I don't even know if it's going to have a guaranteed effect. Well, no, that makes Shifter a second thought to even play. But to even alleviate that whole concern, I think it should be more points to begin with. I think Shifter is in line with a card like Droll, and I think, as I mentioned, Droll should be 15 points. This should be 15 points. I think a slight increase in Shifter would really make you think, like, hey, is this card even worth playing? Because there's a strong chance I don't even play a graveyard deck that will care about it. So, 15 points to Shifter is an adequate adjustment. Let's talk about an over-pointed archetype. Now, I think many people have used the example. I don't know if many people, people in my circle have used the example that Sword Soul is the baseline Genesys deck. Every deck should be as powerful as Sword Soul. And Sword Soul's not even good in Genesys. As you can see, pretty much across the board, I think the cards need to be down in points. The simple answer to this is that Tenyis are so bad because there's no length. So the deck needs a win somewhere, and the deck's not even that good in Genesys standards or current standards or anything. So I think, pretty much across the board, Sword Soul should be down in points. Something I want to talk about is point adjustments need to account for the non-engine being played. Now, I think this is my last point, but I'm going to talk about Pearly as a deck. Now, this idea can be extrapolated. I think extrapolated is a word. I don't know. It could be put onto many other decks, but I'm using Pearly as the example because I know that one best. And before I begin, Pearly is a deck that is super strong, super oppressive. So I'm not saying they put all the Pearly cards to 0, because that's not a good idea. But I'm saying when Konami adjusts the points of cards, they need to do so carefully, because Pearly is pretty much unplayable in this format. Every deck plays Kaijus, every deck plays DD Crow, and half the decks play Ogre and Mourner. The other half of the decks play Mistaken Arrest on the side. All of these cards destroy Pearly. I don't think anyone would want to play Pearly with all these cards in the format. Yet, I don't think anyone would want to play these cards, or Pearly period, because it's so heavily pointed that you have to play half of a deck. So with all that in mind, I think that a lot of archetypes, not just Pearly, but a lot of archetypes are pointed so heavily because they're so good. But when you consider everything else that's going on in the format, the deck's not even good, even if it was 0 points. So, yeah. Guys, I just rabbled on for a long time. Maybe some of my points didn't make sense. I never made a video like this, so I just wanted to get my voice out there. I'm going to use the hashtag YGOGenesis to get this heard, and maybe you guys should do too. Share your ideas on what points should be adjusted. Type in the comments what you think should be changed. If you agree with me, disagree, whatever. And yeah, I hope you guys have a great day, and thanks for watching.